Speaking to a really interesting guest shortly. We're going to be looking at, I think our guest can give us more insight. She's a lecturer in physiotherapy and a founder of the Women's Football Hub. It's a fantastic resource, I think, and I think it's great. The work that she's doing in this area is really, really phenomenal. So, Carolyn Kent, welcome to the show. Great to be on board. Can you maybe give us a bit of an insight into? I don't think I can sort of do the work that you do justice in an intro, but can you give us a bit of an insight to the inspiration to set up the Women's Football Hub?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about Women's Football Hub. To start off with, the hub is basically a platform that discusses all things women and girls' performance in football. We focus on things like sports medicine, physiotherapy, athletic development, which people will know as strength and conditioning, sports science, sports nutrition, sports psychology and podiatry. So we cover a whole load of things. And we've got a website which is www.womensfootballhub.com, and it's got really useful information and links, and it's for players, parents, coaches, professionals and even students who are basically trying to look at how do we train and how do we perform as a female athlete. We've got a podcast, a blog and also some social media channels, so there should be something for everybody. And it basically came about because my background as a football player for a long time, and I played at a decent level in the United States, and I was relatively unfortunate with injury, and I broke my leg, and then in my first game back I actually tore my anterior cruciate ligament, so that kind of led to me having 2 years out of the game. And I look back now and I recognise that one of the reasons why I got injured was I wasn't strong enough or fit enough to play at the level that I was asking my body to play at. And then of course when you return from 2 years out, your third year was of course punctuated by injury upon injury with regards to muscular injuries, hamstring, thigh, calf, you betcha I had it. And then I was fortunate enough to basically be offered a soccer scholarship at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and I ended up with two amazing coaches, Kevin Dempsey and Tim Santoro, who took the chance on me when they didn't have to. I'd been out for 2 years and they basically said, look, come and play full time, and that basically gave me the qualification of being an exercise scientist. And from there I went on and qualified as a physiotherapist at Manchester Metropolitan University, got a great education there, and worked kind of in the NHS for a bit, but then I always kind of knew that football would come calling, and I started off kind of working with Bonner Groves, who are in the second division of the men's kind of championship, and then I also worked with boys youth at the Heart of Midlothian Academy, and just kind of felt my way around about sport. I did a little bit, I kind of worked with Scottish hockey, I did one session with Scottish rugby, realised very quickly that level of trauma was not for me, and then eventually I kind of got a job with the Scottish Football Association, and I worked with the under-13s, the under-19 girls, and that was kind of career changing for me. That was when I recognised I want to kind of work with a female athlete, and that was kind of, once that ended, I kind of thought, you know what, I need a new challenge, and I ended up in academia, which is in the role I'm in now. And I was always very lucky to have some great mentors, and I worked with some excellent physiotherapists who really took me under the wing, and I suppose that's why I'm such a big fan of mentoring and also just giving back. And in May I went to the FIFA's Kinetic Medical Conference, which was held in Madrid, and I was genuinely blown away by the research that these academics were doing. I recognised that a lot of this research wasn't getting to the coaches, and we really had a problem with top-down dissemination of research. It wasn't getting to the players and the coaches on the grounds, or certainly not the ones that were in my circle. And then the way research obviously works is that it's published in a journal. If it's open access, somebody has to go and get it, break it down in explainable terms, and then disseminate it. And if you're working with a team of 25 to 30 players, it's just really slow. It's slow to get that information out there. And some of the information that I was listening to in Madrid was from 2006, and coaches still didn't know about it. So when I got home from the Madrid conference, I thought, you know what, I can help here. I'm pretty good with digital, I'm pretty good with kind of communication, and I thought, I'm going to set up a website, a podcast. I'm going to start to take this information and maybe just connect it with the people that actually really need it. And that was effectively how Women's Football Hub was born, and it's basically my opportunity to give back to football because I owe football.
No, it's fantastic. I think it's great, Carolyn. It's quite inspiring how you sort of what you're doing, and in terms of sort of coaches, you sort of mentioned there the research, and how can sort of things get broken down to a point where a coach can, if it's appropriate and applicable, implement some of the ideas. I know there's so many ideas out there, and it will take a lifetime to talk about. Could you give us an example of maybe some ideas, for example, that in the research that could be broken down to for a coach?
Certainly. I mean, one of the biggest things that we have an issue with, I don't think it'll be a surprise to anybody, that the anterior cruciate ligament injury, generally if you end up with an anterior cruciate ligament injury, you're going to be out for minimum 9 months, right? So it's the biggest time loss. It's not actually the most common injury in football, that actually goes to the thigh. But when it comes to the anterior cruciate ligament, one of the biggest things that we need to do is we need to start preventing these injuries. And we actually have a warm-up protocol called the FIFA 11 Plus, which is for players over the age of 14, and it's basically a 20-minute warm-up, and it contains some running exercises and some strength exercises, and we know that it basically prevents most injuries and even helps us with the ACL issue. Now, what I found is that a lot of these injury prevention protocols are not being implemented. And, that's either because the coach doesn't know about them or because there's significant barriers to actually implementing these things. So one of the first things I would say to coaches is, if you're looking for a warm-up protocol that you can get to your players to do, the FIFA 11 Plus if they're over 14, or the FIFA 11 Kids if they're under 14, and you'll find both of those on our website or on our Instagram page. And the reason why we have to start breaking this down, and I feel sorry for coaches, because coaches have to handle so much. They have to handle the fact that they've got to plan a session, they have to work with the players, they have to get text messages saying I'm going to be late, and I think there is an element of injury prevention that we also need to kind of take back to the players. Now, I know how difficult it is to get behaviour changing players, having worked in football for a long time, but I spoke to one of the world experts on this on the podcast, and she said, if you've not got enough time to fit it into your session, give it to your captain, give it to the players, get them to do it in the parking lot before they get there. It only has to be done twice a week, and we know that it first of all enhances performance. The players play better, your results are better because your players are available, they're not sitting injured on the bench, and it basically keeps them healthy. And when I talk about long-term consequences to tearing your cruciate ligament, one of the biggest things is that once you've torn your cruciate ligament, you are 7 times more likely to require a knee replacement. So when it comes to long-term health and it comes to the economics of healthcare, we need to start preventing these injuries. And when we've got something that we know works, what my question is, well, what are the barriers to implementation? And I think that's part of my dissertation I'm actually doing. I'm actually putting together a study to go and ask coaches, look, how can we get this in more? What help do you need? Is it a case of, I can maybe take some students down to do this for you? I mean, I think there's lots of different things that we can do, but I definitely think there has to be more collaboration between the researchers and the people that are actually feeling the effects of that research.
Absolutely. And with the FIFA 11 Plus warm-up, Caroline, the 4, is that, obviously there's a kids one, but there's also the 14 and above. When you say 14 and above, is that into all age, or is that...
Yeah, so right through, and I mean, is this implemented at pro level? No, but we know that professional level is different. However, I would say that for any recreational player, anyone over the age of 14, the FIFA 11 Plus is the injury prevention protocol that you should be doing. There is also an app that the International Olympic Committee have called Get Set Train Smarter, I think it's called. So you can have these injury prevention protocols for almost every Olympic sport. And I think if I was pleading with coaches to do anything, it would be like, please take a look at these as part of your warm-up. And I also understand some of the challenges with regards to the FIFA 11 Plus that, football people have come back to us and said, well, it doesn't involve the ball enough, and, and I completely understand these things, but I think what I'm saying is right, well, if it has to come out the session, well, can we get it done before you start your session? We know that it keeps your players healthy, and as I said, when we think about the fact that of the long-term knee and health consequences to tearing your ACL, I think 20 minutes twice a week is not a massive ask.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting point you make there, Caroline. I mean, injury prevention, to do everything possible to prevent injuries, got to be the number one objective. Because if you don't have players, if they get injured, obviously, it's for the club, it's a consequence. For the player, obviously, it's a huge consequence. What would you say? I mean, is that something sort of coaches listening in should really take into consideration? To look at as many injury prevention, like you mentioned, the warm up, and not within reason, obviously, but how much of that do you think is really significant? Like really taking on board injury prevention?
Listen, I coach as well, and I've got I coached in the United States, and I think one of the things I recognised setting up this podcast was, just because you put a podcast and a couple of Instagram posts out there, it doesn't mean you're going to get behaviour change. And the question that the coaches will know with everything when it comes down to football is, how do you get the players to buy in? When I set up Women's Football Hub, when I went to ask coaches, what is it that you're needing? There were three things: athletic development, strength and conditioning, sports nutrition, and sports psychology. They didn't look at physiotherapy with regards to injury prevention. Physiotherapy has this reputation that we're only needed when we're needed. And actually, for me, that it's not so much a call out to the coaches, because I understand why coaches kind of look at injury prevention and go, well, listen, that's not my area. I've not really been trained for that. And if you've ever been asked to put something in place that you're not really trained in, of course you're not competent. And who wants to do that in front of a squad of 22 to 25 girls? You don't want to do that. But I think for me, it's, when I spoke to Holly Silver's Granally about this, she basically said, look, when you have a player that has been injured and it's happened, perhaps they're the best person to implement it, because they've got that lived experience. And unfortunately, we don't want them having that lived experience, but sometimes maybe it's a parent or it's a player, because they've had the consequences of the injury. And as I said, we'd love to prevent all injuries, but we also have to be realistic that that's probably not going to happen.
No, absolutely. I mean, obviously, sort of impact injuries beyond your control. There are injuries that we can give ourselves a better chance by warming up. You mentioned the warm-up protocol there as well. I mean, I think the challenge as well, Caroline, in terms of, say, semi-pro or part-time football, amateur football, is, say, maybe they train twice a week, the players. They play once. They might play once a week. The challenge is really in terms of you've got so much time with the players, and sort of so much to do, and also what they do away. Some of them got sort of different type of jobs. They might have a job working in PE, for example. They might have a job at a desk, and individualized programs and doing needs analysis in part-time football is a challenge, really. And in terms of sort of, I know it's difficult to suggest what players do. Everyone's got their own, but I've often thought things like Pilates, yoga, core stability classes may benefit players away from the training ground. What's your take on maybe, and it's hard to gauge, obviously, if they're overtraining and that sort of stuff, but as a starting point, just some ideas I was sort of throwing out there in terms of the class being controlled environment, if they've got like a sort of instructors to sort of guide them through. What's your take on doing work outside the training of the club at part-time level?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because I actually hosted a podcast with the United Kingdom Strength and Conditioning Coach of the Year for Youth Sport, and that's kind of going on to our podcast in January sometime. And I was speaking to him, and he basically said, look, we want to get these players having really good movement. So we want to get them having a good squat, a good hinge, or we would call a deadlift. Can they push effectively? Can they pull effectively? Can they lunge effectively? If you think about how much lunging is actually in football, and we know that most players are actually injured with regards to deceleration. So that is effectively the lunge to then turn and change direction. So it would be more about working on the movement patterns, and some of the things that I've seen have been well intentioned and well meant. We'll do a squat challenge, but actually if you do a squat challenge with your players, effectively what you're doing is doing really high volume, and the question is, what is the quality of that movement like? So when people are saying to me, hey, we want to know things to do with regards to strength and conditioning, the first thing I say is, look, there are some pretty decent online platforms out there where you might be able to go and get that advice. And the strength and conditioning people will always speak about, look, first of all, we need to look at how much are you training, because one of the things I used to see in youth boys football was they were training 7, 8, 9 times a week, and that was over various different sports, and they were coming to me saying my knees are sore, and I'm like, I'm not surprised your knees are sore. And one of the general rules of thumb is if you've got a 10-year-old, they shouldn't be doing more than 10 sessions a week, or for 10 hours, and it's one of those things that you want to kind of have a little look at, what type of sports are they doing, how much are they doing. Sleep in young athletes is crucial for the recovery, so I think for me it's more about, when it comes to strength and conditioning, have a little look at those movement patterns and find somebody who is qualified to teach those movement patterns. I know some of the teams around about where I stay have gone to local gyms, and the girls who have kind of wanted to have gone in, and that's another thing we need to discuss, is some of the issues you have with regards to girls and athletic development and their attitudes towards the gyms. I don't want to lift anything heavy because I don't want it to get bulky. That's not going to happen, because in all honesty most female athletes don't eat enough for that to happen, and also they don't have the hormone profile for that to happen either. So that education out there is massive, and also just, I think what's really nice now is to having the WSL being so visible. They've got role models. They've got role models that the Lionesses, the Scottish national team players, who they can see, they're doing all of that, and I should do that too.
No, absolutely. And my concern would be, Caroline, is that the levels in say semi-pro, part-time are quite transparent. We've got players who've, like yourself, who've sort of played in abroad, and some have played at clubs where they do and teach the mechanical movement of sort of Olympic lifting very young, even with like a non-weight bearing. And you've got players who've never done it before, and sometimes you sort of see these one size fits all programs that players get their hands on, and for me there's always a concern, because obviously sort of like in terms of, can they do mechanical movement, can they do plyometric, and that I think sort of some of the programs sometimes for me, they may be effective for certain players, but they may probably increase injury risk for others, and I think it's a bit of a minefield where that's concerned. But I certainly think that you've made a great point there in terms of obviously now you've got ETCs and all that sort of stuff. Is there a case in point in sort of teaching the players the mechanical movement of weights, young, non-weight bearing, maybe teaching them sort of light plyometric early on, so they can, in a long-term athletic development plan, when they sort of go into the to the youth and senior team, they're more quick to sort of move on to that type of training.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if I take my own experience, one of the reasons I got injured is basically I was going up against players who had been in the gym since they were 14 years old. Now I was 18, 19, I hadn't even seen the inside of a gym. I didn't pick up a barbell till I was 22, and by that point, broken my leg, tore my ACL. Now, I'm not saying that's everybody's experience, but what I am saying is that level of training is very individual, and it's one of the reasons we have to have qualified coaches who understand strength and conditioning and athletic development. And the other thing I'll say is, if you're dealing with the immature skeleton, you've also got issues with regards to growth spurs. There may be times where you don't want to load them, and also, do you need to load them heavy? Sometimes you actually don't. What you need to actually look at is you're looking at trunk control, and that can involve something as simple as balance. You don't need to load that massively heavy, and just because you lift something really heavy doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to have that massive impact on your performance. But one thing I would say is that, players who are typically stronger are typically able to handle more loads with regards to training. So from my perspective, when I'm looking at any athlete, I'll always look at from an individual perspective. And with female athletes, you have to take into account things like the menstrual cycle. You have to take into account how have they grown, what have they eaten, because as I said before, a lot of young girls and female athletes, they have issues with disordered eating. There was a study that came out, I think, last year, that basically said, it was a FIFPro study, that of the elite players that they studied, 1 in 5 had an issue with disordered eating. So we have to be, I don't want to make people fearful of talking to girls about these things, but we have to take into account the entire athlete, because we know that 1 out of every 5 potentially might have issues with disordered eating. So we have to be, mindful of these things when we're starting to train them.
No, absolutely, and that's a really good point, a really important point. because from that perspective, the literature suggests that's a sort of really complex area, disordered eating, and that sort of brings me to sort of the mental health side of things. I think it's really important that, I know this sort of is outside the remit of the conversation, but I think it's really important that staff have got at least a base level to talk to players and signpost, because there is a fine line. There's a line between, say, performance and clinical, Caroline. I mean, players may have an adverse event, and I think or players might be experiencing something. I think it's really important to make sure that the club's got the protocols in place. It's okay, well, in the event of a crisis, obviously sort of like, A&E 999 111 for extra support if you need it, because not everything's about sort of performance. Sometimes players could have a mental health issue as well, that needs to be addressed by the appropriate person, particularly if it is anything around sort of eating or anything for that matter. I think it's really important that the early intervention is key, and it sort of goes outside the scope of the conversation, but I think it's really important to sort of spot behavioural changes and sort of be aware and in tune with the players. Take time to check in. Have a well-being check-in. What's your sort of take on that, Carolyn? Your experience of being a player, coaching, travelling, doing a well-being check-in. Is everyone okay? Is there anything that you don't talk about yet?
I think it's massive, and I've always said, there's a few things you need to consider with regards to female mental health. First of all, if they do have any form of disordered eating and they've got low energy availability, the kind of issue with regards to reduced energy in sport can give issues with, one of the side effects of that can be issues with mental health. I've always said I'm actually quite glad that I played football before a social media age, because I would not have enjoyed being at that level, having constant criticism in my comments and people, mentioning me to tell me how well or how bad that I'd done. And I made a comment about this on it was a kind of mail game where the fans of the team were actually criticising their own player on the official account, and I was like, that player follows that account, and it's easy for people to say, hey, just don't look, and I don't feel that is the case with players. And I think I agree with everything you said. I think from a screening perspective, I've definitely picked up some changes with regards to mood and motivation, and thought you're not quite right, and we've kind of pulled them in for a chat, and that's just been the kind of little kind of part that's made them go, no, I'm not well. And and we've got them the appropriate help. And even although, yes, exercise is very well known to be good for mental health, but there are some areas in sport with regards to, and Dr. Ian Cookson on the platform does a great job with regards to sports psychology, the amount of pressure people put on themselves, pre-performance anxiety, emotional regulation and dealing with the emotions that come, that are involved with football. And a lot of young players don't get input on these things, and a lot of even parents are kind of looking and going, well, where do I go for this information? And I'm kind of hoping that Women's Football Hub can kind of plug that gap a little bit so that we can start to get that information out there. And I will also say that there are some other excellent platforms doing some work in this area. If anybody's into kind of female health, the Well HQ do some great work with regards to female athletes. And I do agree with you, mental health is something that we need to monitor and definitely keep an eye on.
No, absolutely, and I think that's why the work that you do and some of the the apps that you've mentioned and I think are really important. I mean, I believe there is an app around the menstrual cycle as well too, and I think that I suppose it's getting the information out there, which is key. My own experience, anecdotally, Caroline, I don't think there's a lot of support for players outside the pro game in women's football at the moment. And that's why I think people like yourself and other people who are putting stuff together is quite important, really. I mean, maybe it will do in the future. I don't know, but we are where we are type thing at the moment. I think sort of in the pro game they have got a point of contact to get support in those areas, but certainly a concern of mine, and I sort of flagged this up before, is once you start reaching, the tiers outside there, it becomes more difficult for players to access any sort of support. And it is a bit of a concern because my sort of thoughts are, Caroline, is that the players absorb a lot. They've got the game, they've got training. Sometimes they'll play on they play Sunday generally. Then you've got to train Tuesday, which is sort of that gap. Isn't that 48 hours isn't the rest as well, and they're not pro, and it's hard for them to do like a recovery session between say Sunday and Tuesday. So the physical fatigue, but also the mental tiredness too, and then the job as well. So they are, and it is at that level. Everyone's sort of trying to reach the promised land in football to try and get as far up as they can, but in that sort of race to get there and all the things to take into consideration, the big concern is that the players are absorbing a lot. So I think from a coaching perspective, the more platforms like yours out there, the better it is for the players really on their journey to build awareness. And what's your take on it? Is that sort of a fair assessment really that the players do absorb a lot really with playing and jobs as well and all the things that sort of we go through in life too?
Yeah, I mean, when you take amateur players and turn them professional, the reason why you do it is not to train them more; it's to give them more time to rest. That's literally what this is about. It's about time for rest, recovery, and just being able to kind of deal with the demands of the sport. If you think about somebody and this happens in male amateur sport as well, so you come down the pyramid a little bit to those guys that are maybe training twice a week and then playing on a Saturday. When you've got players that are maybe doing manual jobs all week and then they're being asked to play at night, it's no surprise that these people are tired. We know what it's like, just doing a full-time job. I don't have to be a part-time athlete on top of that. And some workplaces are really accommodating with that, but we don't have to go back too far in women's football to find international players who were playing full-time and then having to take unpaid leave from their work to go away with their national team to represent their country. That is not that far away from where we are today, and I think there's still a lot of ways to go with regards to professionalism. But I agree that any player that is playing full time and is playing kind of part time, that's a hard shift.
Absolutely, and I mean the players do for the most part. I'm sure enjoy it. They love the game as well. It's just like a point of consideration in terms of providing players with as much support as possible, because if you're sort of training Tuesday, you can finish training in the evening. Some will just go straight to training from work, so they might even be up for work at 6 o'clock and then they might not have been home, and then they'll come home at 10-11 on a Tuesday, 10-11 on a Thursday. Then they might have to play away on a Sunday and travel 10 hours on a coach each way. So and they do love the game, obviously, I'm sure, and it is a lot of benefits to it too, in terms of even the social side, being out there, exercise, but it is demanding. I think that's sort of something to definitely take in consideration. Yeah,
I think definitely, and if you think about that type of schedule, right? You've been up since first thing in the morning, you've finished a busy shift, say 5 o'clock, you've got to get to training for 7. What have you done with regards to fueling and for dinner?
Yeah.
You're potentially going in there having either potentially picked something up on the road, or potentially even not eating at all. I've seen that before. And then you go home either at night and you have a big meal right before you're due to go to bed, and of course that's going to potentially impact on your sleep. And sleep is absolutely vital for recovery from sport. So as I said, these amateur players, regardless of whether they're male or female, they have a hard shift, and I can understand why some of them kind of go, I'm really tired, and it becomes even more complicated. I've had it where it's been self-employed people who have gotten injured playing football and they still have to go to work. There is no opportunity for them to take time off. They have to make money, so these scenarios with amateur players become more and more complicated at times. And I think when you break it down, all of the research is going into the pro game, because that's where the funding is, that's where the money is. But the majority of the issues that potentially we need to solve were actually in the amateur and youth population that are not involved with professional clubs. And that was basically what I looked at with regards to the research, and thought there's a real need for a platform here that can potentially just give people somewhere to go and even ask questions. And that's one thing I will say about Women's Football Hub. We have an area on there to allow coaches to kind of write to us and ask questions, so that we can potentially, because if you've got that question, you can guarantee other people have that question. And we've had some really nice questions through about how do I talk to my players about the menstrual cycle, because I feel uncomfortable, and we've been able to answer that in Instagram carousel reels that could just be handed to the players.
No, that's brilliant. I think that the work you're doing is phenomenal, Caroline. It really is, and I couldn't have put it better myself in terms of your point there about sort of the amateur semi-pro game, being under-resourced to a certain extent, and I've been involved in the game at that level as well over many years, and I think I echo your sentiments on all that you've said there, which is key. And in terms of anyone, I'm sort of mindful of saying, be very, very kind to sort of share some of your insights. How can people sort of learn more about your work and sort of get on the hub and check it out? Yeah.
So if you're basically looking for us, we have a website. It's www.womensfootballhub.com, and if you scroll all the way to the bottom of that page, all of our social media icons are there, and you can follow us on social media. We also have a podcast. We're available on pretty much all major platforms, and we've also got a little blog on there that you can read, and it's all split into kind of players and parents. There's a coaches segment, and there's also kind of professionals and student segment. I will say that we are very much in the early stages of developing this hub, so please bear with us. We add resources as we go, and as I said, it was a snowball that I pushed down the hill in kind of June, and it has not stopped since. So I will hopefully start to get some weekends back at some point.
No, absolutely. It's great stuff, and I'll certainly spread the word and share it as well, Karen. I want to thank you for your time. It's been really interesting and informative. I've been sort of taking notes as well while you were speaking there as well. So it's been like sitting in a lecture for me as well. We're always learning. So thanks again for your time, Caroline. I wish you all the best with the hub, and I'm sure it'll continue to grow. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.